Now, we're not sure who wrote Hebrews. It's a bit of a mystery, and actually it's in amongst a whole load of letters in the New Testament, but it's really more of a sermon than a letter to a bunch of Jewish Christians, a local congregation, who the writer seems to know personally, and who were facing a real threat of terrible persecution and a real testing of their faith. And there was also a little tension in their little church community. So the writer to the Hebrews is trying to reassure and encourage the Christians, and because he's writing to a largely Jewish audience, he pulls out tons of Old Testament imagery. So it's a great book for seeing how the Old and New Testaments tie together and how Christ fulfills so much of the Old Testament. Now, in the time when Hebrews was written, the Romans, who were obviously in charge at that time, initially, they kind of tolerated these new Christians. And that was kind of how it was for a while. And the church were kind of growing. And it was a bit tricky to be a Christian, but not too bad. But then there was a great fire in Rome in AD 63. And the then Roman emperor blamed the Christians for it. And from that point, all Christians had a target on their back. And so one commentator writes this: when we read Hebrews, it becomes evident that the sermon was addressed to persons whose world was falling apart. The fact that they were Christians brought no privilege to them. In fact, it appeared to mark them out for a fresh experience of suffering. You see, the people that the writer to the Hebrews were writing to were having to take seriously the cost of following and living for Jesus. And the writer to the Hebrews wants them to hear God's voice speaking and to remain faithful and truthful. In chapter 3, verse 15, he writes, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion." And so as we hear what the writer to the Hebrews has to say to us, as we hear God's voice through the pages of Scripture, let's also be praying that our hearts also would not be hardened. Let's be praying that, like the writer to the Hebrews wants us to, that we would listen to God's voice, that we would hear his voice and obey it now. The same writer says this: Hebrews is a sensitive response to the emotional fragileness that characterises each one of us. There's some amazing stuff in the book of Hebrews. And as I say, these Hebrews are facing persecution and potentially death for admitting they were Christians, as many of our brothers and sisters are around the world. And actually, the consequences of being a Christian in this country are getting ever more serious. But these Christian believers, like we do, need to know and be reassured that God was there and that he's not silent. That God speaks. And that's really important, isn't it? Because actually, when we look at the world around us, actually, the God of secularism is silent. And he doesn't speak because it's all about what's inside us and working it out for ourselves. So when people cry out and go, "What am I supposed to do?" there's a deathly silence in the secular way of looking at things. The God of other faiths is distant and not personal. I wonder, have you ever been tempted to think, is God there? Maybe you felt in times of difficulty, God seems silent. Where's his voice? Maybe you feel abandoned by God. I'm guessing many of us have felt like that at times in our lives. Well, read Hebrews, which is what we're going to be doing together. Because Hebrews tells us God has spoken. And first of all, in these first 4 verses, we see that God has spoken in the past. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. Now, when we fall out with somebody, when we have an argument, the first thing that goes is communication, isn't it? Maybe you've had an argument with a sibling. Maybe you've had an argument with a husband or wife, and you end up sulking and going into separate rooms and not speaking to each other for an hour or two. Maybe you have such a falling out that you end up not really speaking for weeks or months or even years. Actually, a mark of broken relationships is silence, isn't it? You might exchange, niceties. You might talk about things which, if you put the bins out or whatever. But the reality is, in that broken relationship, there's silence. When people are estranged from parents, the phrase that they'll often say is, "Oh, I haven't spoken to them for years." It's incredibly hard and hurtful. And actually, due to our sin, our relationship with God is broken. We deserve silence from God, don't we? And as I said, maybe there are times when we do feel God is silent, that he's not there. And it's horrible, isn't it, when, in that broken relationship, you're on the receiving end of the silent treatment. And as I say, we deserve the silent treatment. But Hebrews starts by saying, God speaks. Right back in the beginning of the Bible, God literally speaks creation into existence, doesn't he? Because God is a speaking God. And as the writer speaks to the Hebrews, he says, look, in the past, God has spoken in different ways through the prophets, through our forefathers, at various times and in various ways. But you see, that speaking that God did, that was incomplete and unfulfilled. Actually, if we were to jump on to chapter 11 of Hebrews, you'd see a whole list of a whole load of those forefathers who God spoke through. Brilliant chapter 11. And if you put yourselves in the shoes of those New Testament Christians, maybe those who have come to faith in Jesus but never met Jesus, they've just heard somebody talking to them about Jesus. And especially, this was particularly written to Jewish people who'd become Christians. Well, for the Jewish people, they were like, well, God last spoke about 500 years ago, and we haven't really heard much since. What about now? They may have been saying. Where is God speaking now? How is God speaking now? Well, the writer to the Hebrews says, long ago, at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So God's spoken in the past, he says, but now look how God has spoken. Look at the way he chose to speak to the one he sent with his message. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. And there's only a few verses here. We're only looking at 4 verses. But they are absolutely jam-packed with tons of stuff that we don't have enough time to go into any near the amount of depth that it would be lovely to go into. But look at all these things that it tells us. God spoke through his Son Jesus. Here, God speaks finally and fully. And actually, the wonderful thing is, God speaks to us in a way that we can understand and hear, because he loves us so much. He's not trying to make things difficult or complicated. God speaks to us so that we can understand and hear. He speaks through his son Jesus. And did you notice there's a whole ton of stuff that we're told about Jesus here? First of all, we see in verse 2 that he is the heir of all things. Everything belongs to him. And we are his. The whole world, the whole universe belongs to him. And we know from the beginning of Genesis that in that created order, humanity is the height of that created order. It's the best bit. We're the best bit. It's amazing. And everything belongs to Jesus, including us. We belong to Jesus through his death on the cross. So Jesus, the one who spoke the word, is the heir of all things. And he created all things. The world was created through Jesus. You see that in the second half of verse 2. And also, again, that, as Mark said, if you were here in the mornings, as we've been going through John's Gospel, there is so much sort of link with John's Gospel. So, you could jump back to John chapter 1, verse 3 to see that. And indeed, Paul shows us it in Colossians chapter 1 and says, "For by him, by Jesus, all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or demons or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him." See, all of time and space, everything is created through Jesus. He was there in the beginning as God spoke the word. So Jesus is the heir of all things. All things were created through him. He is the radiance of the glory of God, verse 3. That means that all of God's greatness is perfectly seen in Jesus. Again, let's jump back to John chapter 1, verse 14. "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." As Mark said, it does reflect John chapter 1, these verses, doesn't it? Jesus is the radiance of God's glory. And he's the exact imprint of the nature of God. That doesn't mean he's the same as God. He's still distinct. There is a distinction between the nature of God the Father and God the Son, between their persons. But actually, as we look at Jesus, if we want to see God's glory in all its fullness, look to Jesus. If we want to see what God is like, look to Jesus. Back to John chapter 1 again, verse 18. "No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." Want to know what God the Father's like? Look to Jesus the Son. And this word through whom all things was created didn't just make our universe and leave it ticking like a wound-up clock. No, we see he sustains the universe. He upholds the universe by the power of his words. As one person put it, he's the cosmic sustainer. Jesus' powerful words keeps the planets in orbit. I wonder, do we have a big enough vision of who Jesus is and what he's done for us? Even we think of Jesus the man, but here we see the writer to Hebrews saying the world was created through Jesus and he sustains it and he continues to sustain it. We take our next breath because Jesus makes it possible. The daffodils spring up outside on the church path because Jesus makes it possible. Jesus upholds the universe by the power of his word. And his word is powerful. Later on in Hebrews, the writer tells us that his word is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword in chapter 4. Jesus is powerful. And in his power, we also see the weakness as he died on the cross. That we're going to be remembering his death as we share the bread and the wine a little bit later. But he did that, and it's interesting what the writer points out here, to make purification for sins. He wants these people who are struggling, who are lacking confidence, who are facing persecution, to be encouraged and reminded of the God who speaks, of how he's spoken, of who he's spoken through, of sins forgiven through his death, of power to create and sustain. Jesus purified us from our sin. That's the effect of Christ's death. It's personal. It's something he did for each one of us. He won our forgiveness on the cross. And now, having risen to new life and ascended into heaven, now we see, end of verse 3, he sat down at the right hand of majesty on high. Now it's important to notice here that Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God. He's not like tired out, so he's having a bit of a sit down. No, you see, in the Old Testament, when the priests made their sacrifices, they stood to make the sacrifices. And they stood because they had to, and they kept making the sacrifices because the sacrifices that they made in the Old Testament was never complete. They had to keep making it again and again and again. So the priests stand and they make the sacrifice day after day. Jesus makes the sacrifice. He is the sacrifice, and he sits down because the job's done. Doesn't have to be done again. Doesn't have to make another sacrifice. Jesus sits at the right hand of the majesty on high, at the right hand of God, that place of honour reserved for the king. So as he sits, having finished his work of making the sacrifice, he sits in the place of honour and is king, ruling. His work is finished. The job is done. Isn't that a wonderful image of Jesus sitting, having finished the job, ruling over us? One writer says this: Jesus now rules and cares and forgives with full divine authority and power. So, look, the writer says, this is how God spoke. But now, look how God is speaking. And look at the one who is speaking. Look at what he's like. Look at his power and his authority. Which means we really need to listen. We really need to take note because of who it is that's speaking. You know, when you're in, think back to secondary school. And I apologise to any past secondary school teachers, but this is the reality of it, okay? When you get a teaching assistant in front of the kids, they kind of don't really pay very much attention. In fact, worse, one rung down from a teaching assistant is the supply teacher. Then they're just like, oh, we don't care, we'll just do whatever, and swap seats and change names and all sorts of things I've heard of. And the young people, maybe they don't really listen to them too much. Hopefully, the young people will listen to their teachers. Their teachers know what they're talking about, and the young people will listen to them. However, when one of the senior staff comes along, you don't half listen, don't you? Especially if it's the head teacher. I mean, I remember when my head teacher used to speak, I couldn't even walk past him without trembling in the corridor, because you listen, because you know the authority of the one who's speaking to you. Here we see, don't we, in great detail and depth, the authority of the one who speaks. Don't we need to listen? It's not some supply teacher talking here. This is the Lord Jesus. And the writer goes on to kind of use this funny illustration where he talks about having become much superior to angels, as the name he's inherited is more excellent than theirs. And it's slightly odd, isn't it? But he's continuing the theme of trying to show why we need to listen to the one who's speaking now. And why actually these Hebrews don't need to be fearful. He describes Jesus as more superior to the angels. Now, very often when we think of angels, and I think particularly the case in sort of more evangelical, conservative evangelical churches, we sort of think, oh yeah, angels, they're nice, they're in the Bible, right, let's move on. A bit too complicated. Or maybe we kind of have the image that you see at Christmas of, the nativity, and they're always girls in nativity plays, when in the angel often they're described as male. But anyway, and the wings and all this kind of stuff, it's just not helpful. But actually in Jewish culture that they would have been part of, actually angels were held in really high regard. In the Old Testament, the angels are seen as God's messengers, God's heralds, God's mediators. They were often the ones who were seen as giving God's message to these prophets in the past. And so the angels for Jewish people were held really right up there. They had a very different way of thinking about them than we do. And so the writer to the Hebrews is saying, look, you think the angels are great? You think they're impressive? Well, they're in nothing in comparison to Jesus. He's way more than a herald or a messenger. Jesus himself, the writer to the Hebrews is saying, Jesus himself is the message and he's the messenger of this new revelation of God, the new covenant. The angels in the Old Testament were also associated with the giving of the law in the Old Testament. And actually, the writer of the Hebrews is saying, and Jesus is greater than the angels because he's fulfilled the law. He's not just giving the law, he's fulfilled the law. At times, we know in the Bible, people were tempted to worship angels. But Jesus is greater because he is to be worshipped. There were times when people in the Bible were somebody thought they were an angel and they'd try and bow down and worship them. And they say, no, don't worship me. But Jesus is to be worshipped because he is greater. There were other ideas from Jewish theology, not so much from the Bible, but which were ideas in Jewish thinking at the times, which said angels ruled various nations and that kings were subject to the archangel Michael. Well, Jesus is greater because he rules over the nations. He rules over everything we've seen here, haven't we? And so therefore, his name is greater. The writer here is reassuring these young, struggling believers. God is not silent. He wants to be known. Look at how he's speaking now. Be reassured, be comforted, and take courage. Maybe when we feel like God's not there or silent, well, read Hebrews 1 again. See what it's saying to us. Be reminded that God speaks and still speaks. He reveals himself and he wants to be known and he wants us to know him. Another commentator writes this: the writer believes in a great and mighty God, yet a God who is so powerful that he can come down to our level and speak in human language. He does this through the revelation of his Son, Jesus, and in Jesus, and by Jesus. As we go through the book of Hebrews, let's be challenged to listen and obey, because our God speaks. That's brilliant. Let's pray, shall we?